to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live. We're in Ottawa, Ontario, where the Pierre Savard Conference, which is the graduate student conference here at the University of Ottawa, is currently wrapping up. And we are very fortunate to have the keynote speaker from that conference. He spoke Wednesday nights at the Wine and Cheese opening reception, here from the University of Saskatchewan and a U Ottawa alum, Robert Englebert. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you here as a University of Regina alum. I'm always excited when fellow Saskatchewan folks swing by campus. So we're excited to have you here, even if the time change may have thrown you off a little bit.
I survived. It's actually pretty cool out. It reminds me a little bit of the weather out in Saskatoon.
Yeah, I mean, today it's sunny and cool, but there's a lot of wind. It's
very Saskatchewan.
Very Saskatchewan type of day out there. Well, first of all, before we get into your actual work, just Saskatchewan in general, because I love Saskatchewan. You're from Montreal. You did a PhD here. Then you move out to Saskatchewan. How are you liking it? You've been there for 5 years.
It's been great. It's been a great opportunity to learn about another part of the country. I had been out there a few times before. During my PhD research, I had done some conferences and some community work out there, but teaching out there has been wonderful. It's a great city, wonderful university, and a very collegial history department at University of Saskatchewan.
Yeah, Jim Clifford, who's an editor here at Active History, is just got hired out there and just had a baby, which we're very excited about, and congratulations to Jim and his wife.
Yeah, we're all excited to have him out there too, and we're all happy for the baby as well. Another historian on the way. Yeah,
and that's probably good timing for Jim too. At the end of the semester here, if he's not teaching this summer, he can sort of take a little time to hang out with the baby.
I think he got his marking done just before, so It worked out perfectly.
Now, you study something rather interesting, or something that we've never talked about on this show, which is one of the many reasons I wanted to have you on. You study French colonial presence in North America.
Absolutely.
In the 18th century.
Correct.
Now, we just came from a panel, a roundtable discussion, in talking about how we make history relevant or how we get people engaged in history. And it's something that, I don't want to say for someone like me it's easy, but I say to somebody I study the CBC, and they say, oh, I listened to this, I watched this. And it's somewhat of an easy hook because everyone knows what the CBC is. But for you, that might be a little more difficult. So I'm just wondering how you deal with people when you try to explain what you do to people who are outside of the history profession.
Well, that's a great question. It can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. One of the things that really got me going on this research, one of the big impetus for my work, was that I was really contesting national narratives, both in Canada and the United States, to give a really different interpretation, not just of French North American history, but also of 18th century colonial history. So when I'm explaining to people that don't know much about the topic at all, I usually start with the general story of Canada. How did Canada come about? Or if I'm talking to an American audience, how did the United States come about? And then deconstruct those myths and start to talk about the research and how it gets us to sort of break beyond some of these national narratives and these boundaries that we've sort of set up for ourselves.
Well, so give us an example of one national narrative that may not hold water in terms of the research. Because, I mean, most people have the idea of French come over, fur trade, beaver trapping, sort of spread west, and dealing with First Nations people as they go west, and the process of that and the many layers to that. But I think the general narrative is we're chasing beavers across the continent to send the pelts back to Europe.
Well, and that's a big part of it. So this whole East-West narrative that Canada and the United States both work on these East-West trajectories. So in Canada, we can talk about people like Harold Innis and Donald Creighton, and the fact that this is sort of, especially for Innis, the fur trade is the creation of Canada. It's not just all these commodities, but the fur trade in particular is one of these special commodities, and chasing the beaver west creates the nation of Canada.
Right.
And in the United States, it's a little bit different. You've got Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, this idea that the living on the frontier and not just living on the frontier, but the experience on the frontier and pushing that frontier westward is the process of becoming America. So America is forged on the frontier moving west. The way that my research breaks through those really old narratives that have stayed remarkably persistent in academic literature and in popular notions of these two nations is that French North America it did run somewhat east-west. It also ran very much north-south, from the northeast Atlantic all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. A big part of that was trade through the Great Lakes. The St. Lawrence, of course, runs out towards the south, starts out in the southwest, and then all the way down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. So focusing on the north-south trajectory as opposed to an east-west trajectory really helps to start to bring that research to light and provide a counter-narrative to this type of history.
And it's something I tangentially worked with Nicole St. Ange and Brenda McDougall, who you're very familiar with. Nicole St. Ange was your supervisor here.
Absolutely.
On their project on the Trottier Brigade that they had going, I was at a few meetings taking notes. I certainly wasn't doing research, as it's not my area. But one of the things that they noted in this research and following this brigade is that they're going from what is now Manitoba into Saskatchewan, down into the Dakotas and around. So this notion of an east-west border doesn't matter to them, and they're hopping all over the place. So are you part of this trend that goes along with that project in stating that, the borderlands or the borders aren't really maybe as important as we think they are in the 21st century?
Absolutely. I would agree with that 100%. I have had many conversations with Professor St. Ange and Professor Brenda McDougall as well, and much of our collaborative work in terms of discussion and research over the years has led to sort of a synthesis of this idea that mobility and working on north-south access as opposed to an east-west access offers new opportunities for research and analysis. In fact, I frame my work, which is a little bit earlier than those Trottier brigades, but I frame my work as transcolonial and early transnational history, looking at those networks even as the geopolitics of North America change. What a big part of what I argue is that those networks are maintained and even expanded in some instances, and leads to a great deal of social continuity of French North America from Quebec City all the way to New Orleans, well into throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th century. And so that's quite a change in the historical narrative, which wants to do away with French North America quite early on, as early as 1763.
Right, because you've written about the 7 Years' War.
Yeah.
So you're addressing this notion that the 7 Years' War, to a certain extent, was the end of French, of a strong French presence in North America?
Well, it changes the narrative. Right, it changes the story. So when we look at New France, although there has been quite a bit done specifically on Quebec and specifically on Acadia and specifically on New Orleans, there is a fairly broad consensus in quite a bit of the research that the French Empire in North America, spanned the continent, included the Caribbean, that it was this big area. How much it was truly in control by the French, well, that's a different question. But in terms of French presence, that it was sort of incredibly diverse and spanned the continent. And for some reason, after 1763, that story changes. Almost instantaneously, the history of French North America becomes the history of Quebec or the history of Acadia. You don't hear much about New Orleans anymore. You don't hear about the Great Lakes. You don't hear about the Illinois country in the middle Mississippi Valley. It all becomes very Quebec-centric to a great extent. And only later on do you start to get an expansion beyond Quebec with histories of Canadian provincial francophone associations and populations. And so it's this sudden turn from French North America to Quebecois history that didn't make a lot of sense to me. And so I'm really trying to look at, well, what happens to all of French North America after 1763?
Is that narrative the result of available sources, or is it part of a trend of maybe Anglophone historians early Anglophone historians trying to maybe discount the significance of the French presence in North America? Or is there a combination there, or is it something that I'm not seeing?
A little bit of both. There are lots of sources. That's part of the reason why I stumbled across this topic, was that I was down in St. Louis doing research in what was Spanish Upper Louisiana, and came across piles and piles of documents detailing the connections between merchants and family members in the Illinois country and their contacts and family members in places like Montreal, Trois-Rivières, Quebec City, and even having their contact with people all the way down to New Orleans. And so that really got me to question the story that I had sort of internalized, this historical concept of French North America kind of disappears after 1763 and becomes Quebec. But it's also been perpetuated. This idea has been perpetuated surely by people like Francis Parkman, who in his treatment of the 7 Years' War, it's the victory of Anglo-American Protestantism over French Catholicism. In fact, Jay Gitlin has recently noted how Francis Parkman is part and parcel with Frederick Jackson Turner, have set up this narrative where French and Aboriginal peoples are kind of erased from the narrative following the 7 Years' War. Right. French people especially, and Aboriginal peoples continuously thereafter with the frontier thesis. But there's also Quebec historians as well, and some, not all Quebec historians, but some Quebec historians, Québécois nationalist historians, who have favored a nationalist narrative, have focused almost exclusively on Quebec. And so to not look beyond Quebec's borders in some of those instances creates certain problems in terms of the interpretation of this period in the 18th century.
Now, one of the things you mentioned is these networks that are created across the continent between these francophones. How are those networks maintained in a period where you have the 7 Years' War, then you have the American Revolution, and you have this significant movement of people throughout the continent? So I'm curious as to how these networks are maintained in a period where communications isn't very reliable.
Well, that is a great question, and I think it's fair to say that there are times of disruption. The 7 Years' War is a period of disruption, and communication and trade is slowed between the St. Lawrence Valley, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River Valley. But there are times when it is renewed, so it's a temporary stoppage. There are still people going back and forth, traders, merchants plying their trade on the rivers. But the 7 Years' War is a bit of an interruption. The American Revolution, not nearly as much. Even occupation of a place like Montreal doesn't have a major effect on traders going out to the west. There seems to be continual trade going back and forth. And the American Revolution, though the Americans do take over the Illinois country in 1778, they do so with very little violence. There are no major battles. They're able to take the major town of the Illinois country, Kaskaskia, really without a fight. And so because of that, there's a certain amount of tranquility, a certain amount of stability on the ground that allows. But one of the things that we tend to overlook is just how continuous trade is between these regions. People are going back and forth at a rate that really I found quite surprising. I thought it would be an occasional group, but we've got, lists of hundreds of voyageurs after 1763 going down to the Illinois country from Montreal, testament of continued fur trade.
That's really surprising to me, just because, again, maybe it's just this narrative that's in my head, is that once you have this situation post 7 Years' War where that border becomes a little more defined, that transportation or movement back and forth would be a little more restricted, and especially once you get into the 1770s. But that's not the case.
No, it's in fact what I what I realized through much of this research was just how porous these borders really were. Imperial maps of grand design look great on paper and certainly played in the minds of imperial administrators, but on the ground, and Colin Calloway speaks to this in his book Scratch of a Pen, on the ground much remained as it was before. And Calloway didn't provide a ton of empirical research for that, but he hit the nail on the head in saying that, and I think my research really bears that out to a great extent.
If there is this great movement in the continued trade, isn't one of the reasons why the French involved themselves in the American Revolution is to maintain their presence, or maintain a French presence, and for the continuation of their relationships with First Nations in the West, and to open up the West in part for themselves? So if the trade is continuing, is that notion then contradicted by the French involvement in that conflict?
Well, it's a good question. There's a little bit of a distinction that has to be made between French imperial policy of grand design and interference in the American Revolution, and those long-standing French families who are in the heart of North America and traveling back and forth to places like New Orleans and up to Montreal and throughout the Great Lakes, who really are aware. They hear about French movements. They hear what's going on in France. They're surprisingly well informed, although there's a delay because of seasonal movement of trade goods. But at the same time, they're somewhat disconnected from that. They're not plugged into those networks in quite the same way. Part of that has to do with the change that happens in the Montreal merchant community and the French Montreal merchant community following the British conquest, where many of those French merchants begin a slow and gradual process of transferring their assets and material wealth from places like La Rochelle and Bordeaux to trading houses in London, and also the way that those French families start to intermarry with some of the British merchant families, including families like the McGill family. And so their connections to France by the American Revolution, I would say, especially in the interior of North America, is somewhat negligible.
So the French government isn't deriving a lot of benefits from their presence?
No, and it's too far from the main theater of war in terms of the real battles of the American Revolution, which really take place primarily in the 13 colonies, and not overwhelmingly in the Trans-Appalachian frontier, and especially not right towards the Mississippi. In fact, I would say that the French really develop, in terms of metropolitan France, develop a much more acute interest in renewing French empire, not during the American Revolution, but actually in the wake of the French Revolution. And into the Napoleonic period, where you actually have French representatives traveling through the heart of North America, writing reports, sending them back, and this is all part of the possibility of a renewed French presence in North America.
Oh, that's really interesting, and I guess perhaps the situation in Haiti at the same time, maybe it could be a reflection of that as well.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the big reasons why Napoleon scraps any plans at renewed empire in North America has to do with losses in the Caribbean and having to deal with something like Haiti.
Right. I did a year at the University of the West Indies in Barbados, and I took a Caribbean history course. And the first day, the professor came in and she said, for your term papers, you can write about whatever you want in this time period in the Caribbean. Don't write about Haiti, though. She added in parentheses, it's too complicated, and it's such a messy situation that you can't cover it even remotely adequately in an 8-page paper.
It is an incredibly complicated history, and for somebody who deals more with the heart of North America, the Great Lakes, the Pays d'en Haut, le Pays des Illinois, Louisiane, but especially Upper Louisiana, I have to admit that the Caribbean's not exactly my area of specialty. But there is a relationship, obviously, between what's happening in the Atlantic world and what's happening in places like the French Caribbean, and how that affects people in Louisiana and, by consequence, the heart of North America as well.
Yeah, because you really do have to look at it in this larger regional theater, and because everything sort of plays off each other. And to say, I'm only going to look at the Great Lakes, you're kind of, cutting off your nose to spite your face a little bit, because you can't get the full picture that way.
It's an incredibly messy and complicated world, the mid-18th century. There's so much geopolitical change. I work in English, French, and Spanish, not to mention having to be concerned with indigenous languages and indigenous historiographies as well. And this is all really important, you're grappling with Canadian history, American history, Spanish history. There are all these different historiographies. Sometimes you don't really feel like you're an expert in any of them. You're sort of a jack of all trades. But it also makes it an incredibly fruitful venture in that you get all these different ways of thinking about the heart of North America and what's happening there.
This actually leads me into a question about the notion of nations. You talk about the mid-18th century, and this is when you could argue that nationhood in North America really cements itself, even before the American Revolution. But you have, really for the first time, these large nation states that are forming. And you're researching, or your research overlaps with this process. So I'm curious as to how much of your work then speaks to this theme that has emerged recently, that basically the creation of a nation state, and that nation states are not, permanent things. They are somewhat artificially created, and your research is right in the middle of this process. And so how much do you speak to those issues?
Well, I think in the fact that I'm trying to break away from these national narratives that are based on contemporary national and provincial borders is part and parcel with acknowledging that we're in the very earliest period of the arrival of the nation state. And I certainly wouldn't deny that the American Revolution is crucial for the creation of the American nation and for that nation state. But in Canada, it's a little bit more complicated. And so that's why I really talk about this as transcolonial and early transnational, because there is the emergence of nation states in the period that I'm dealing with, but not everywhere, and not all people are part of these nation states.
Right.
Or if they are, they're trying to get in different ways. For instance, when the French population in a place like the Illinois country is incorporated into the United States, they're really interested, people on the ground are really interested as to how that is going to affect them. Will they get to keep their property? What are their rights? They petition Congress on numerous occasions. So there is a dialogue to be had. At the same time, these are people that have lived under multiple regimes. French, British, in some cases they've crossed the Mississippi into Spanish territory, and now they're, American. And so there's a little bit of reticence in terms of just jumping on board, and there is a bit of a debate in the historiography regarding French peoples in the heart of North America as to how quickly they jumped on the bandwagon to become Americans. Right?
Yeah, I guess you have to be conscious not so much of where people are living as so much as how they identify themselves, as whether they're French, whether they're American, whether they're Canadian, whether they're whatever. That's really more important than necessarily saying, oh, you live in Illinois in this time, you're American. Because if the person doesn't identify as such, then you can't really place it on them, because it doesn't help really understand why they did what they did.
That's right. And there's also the question of not just a national identity in terms of nation state, but also ethnic identities.
Right.
And so some of my current work that I'm sort of moving into now is about questioning the way that we label peoples. And this comes out of my early work on what I call the French River world, these connections that connect the St. Lawrence and the Middle Mississippi Valley after 1763. What do we mean by French? When I say people are French, or I say they're English or British, or if I say they're Aboriginal, I mean, what does that mean?
Right.
What am I really referring to? Are they self-identifying? Most of the evidence that I've found from research in this region speaks to a real fluidity in the ethnic boundaries. The solidification of ethnic identifiable boundaries really only develops, in my opinion, as we get closer to the 1830s. To talk about that, especially in the latter half of the 18th century, I think is premature, and the only exception to that might be the civic nationalism and the civic identification with the emergence of the American nation-state.
But then I thought those civic nationalisms predated that. Like you have this notion of during the Revolution, somebody from Virginia coming in as a Virginian and saying, I'm a Virginian, and you get that all across the country.
Certainly, but I'm referring to mostly to the populations of the Middle Mississippi Valley, specifically here.
Okay. Now, you mentioned your new work. I'm really interested in this. We talked about this a little bit the other day, and you're starting to venture into that fun interdisciplinary world, which you've talked about a little bit. So before we really get into it, just explain sort of, you touched on it a bit, but exactly where you're going now with your newer research.
Well, strangely enough, a lot of my newer research contests a lot of my older research. It doesn't completely do away with the overarching argument, but rather it contests my previous hypotheses in that it's getting me to nuance some of my thinking and finding on these. One of the ways that I've been doing this is by looking at things like métissage. So how do French Aboriginal relationships, how do we define people of mixed descent, how did they act and define themselves? These are questions that come out of my close association with Métis studies, not just in Western Canada where I work, but also my early work working with Professor Nicolas Saintonge, who works on Métis history. And so to think about ethnic categorization in this way, self-identification, community building, and kinship, really gets me to question what I meant when I said a French River world, the maintenance of a French River world after 1763. And so I do this primarily through a number of biographical case studies. Another way that my work is challenging my previous notions of continuity is to look at how law changes and how law was implemented in these territories. There's great geopolitical change throughout North America in the 18th century. How do the laws keep up? Do they tie people together? Do they separate people from each other in different regions? Are laws in Montreal after the Royal Proclamation or the Quebec Act, is some semblance of French civil law accepted in the Illinois country once it's American? What about Spanish Upper Louisiana? These all have different regimes now with potentially different ways of operating legally, and yet my preliminary research seems to certainly uphold my notion of maintenance of French community building, because they're able to use these legal processes across these different regimes.
So is it almost like a certain form of common law where it sort of gets established one place, and then as people move, they sort of bring it, and there might be minor adjustments depending on the location, but the overarching principles stay the same?
To some degree. Most of these come from looser understandings of the French code for the Coutume de Paris, which was used in New France and continues to operate largely in the Middle Mississippi Valley, both on the east and the west side of the Mississippi, and which continue to be used in conjunction with some British legal elements in the new province of Quebec.
So this stuff is ongoing, so I won't push on it too much. But I find it really interesting that you're doing stuff now that, as you say, challenges your previous conceptions on this period. That strikes me as something that perhaps a lot of people might not be willing to do. You know, they put this stuff out, they believe in it, and they move on to something else. Was it difficult for you to look back and challenge yourself in this way?
Oh, that is a good question. I think that from an intellectual side, I was never concerned with revising my ideas, rethinking my ideas. I take a little bit of inspiration from somebody like Jacqueline Peterson, who wrote on Great Lakes Métis back in the 70s, and just recently has really revised some of her thinking on that, especially with a proliferation of literature on the topic in the last 10 to 15 years. And so she's sort of radically rethought that. I thought that was very brave and an important adjustment that had to be made. So from an intellectual standpoint, I think it's incumbent upon us as academics to constantly be questioning our arguments and our thinking on these things. At the same time, you do worry more in the realm of publishing, that you've published things that then later on you might not feel quite as strongly about, or that you may want to nuance a little bit. And I have to say that while I am contesting some of my previous assertions, I haven't destroyed my entire central argument. And so much of this question is about refining my thinking rather than sort of tearing down what I previously built.
You used the word nuance before, which I think is a good way to look at it. You're adding another layer to the work. And that strikes me as that could be a very liberating experience as well, that you have the opportunity to add that nuance to it and refine it in a sense that you're not, the stuff that's out there, the overarching part of it, you're not getting rid of that, but it gives you the opportunity to delve deeper and to give greater voice to this time period, which strikes me as that could be a very liberating experience.
It can be, and I've always seen the academic venture is very much a work in progress, that you never completely finish, and that you're constantly revising. Of course, you have to put it down on paper at some point, and I'm sure there may be things that I'm even saying in this interview which I may contest in the future and completely revise. But the idea that you continue to rethink, revise, and keep your mind open to alternative possibilities, I think, is a part of what we do as academics.
For me, there was an experience in the fall. I was at Guelph giving a talk about my dissertation topic, and somebody asked a question, and as she was asking the question, something just hit me. It was like, oh yeah, I've been thinking about this aspect of it completely wrong. And it opened it up, and now the dissertation is much better because, well, frankly, because of the question. But also, I mean, this notion of you got to continue to rethink things, and you got to continue to analyze and think deeper about stuff, because really that's just the way it is. I mean, history's not perfect, and you're never going to write a perfect paper or a perfect book. That just doesn't happen. So you have to be open to these changes and challenging yourself, because otherwise, what are we doing? Now, there's a new book with your name on it, which is always very exciting, right?
Yes.
You co-edited this with Guillaume Teasdale.
Correct.
I hope I pronounced that right.
Yep, you got it.
Called French and Indians in the Heart of North America, 1630 to 1815. Came out officially last year.
Correct.
Now, I always say officially because those publication dates don't necessarily reflect when it comes out sometimes.
It actually did come out in 2013, so they got it right this time around.
Good. Okay. Just a little bit before we talk about the contents of the book, you talked the other day about putting together an edited work, which obviously is different from putting together a monograph.
Absolutely.
How did you find that process? Was it what you expected when you started?
It was nothing like what I expected, not at all. Guillaume and I were at a conference. We were both PhD students at the time, and we were thinking very much that we would like to have our name on a book, but knew that it would be a while because we were still in the process of finishing our PhDs. And we thought it would be much easier to do an edited book, something that we could work on in the meantime and also give a bit of a distraction from our research and our writing on our dissertations. And so he had already, along with his supervisor, Caroline Podruchny, put together a number of excellent panels for the French Colonial Historical Society at Quebec City, and we turned to those panels initially as a call for papers for an edited volume. Mm-hmm. What ended up happening, though, was that we ended up getting some from that conference and a few that we were able to solicit more broadly from the wider academic community. It ended up being an incredibly long project. We went through 2 different publishers. One publisher pretty much went under, causing us to find another one. So we had an initial book contract, and then when that publisher basically went away, we had to find another one. And it was a long project. It took 4 or 5 years, which was longer than we wanted, but we were also very new at this. And we're very thankful that our authors stuck with us, because it did end up making for, I think, an excellent collection. But it certainly tested everybody's patience. And it's difficult. You don't realize some of these were graduate students. In fact, I think almost everybody who was a PhD student, about half the contributors were PhD students, they all have tenure-track jobs, which is quite phenomenal.
That's really good, yeah.
And then on top of that, we had a number of established scholars, and trying to keep them all working to deadlines and doing revisions, and we didn't know how this stuff worked, so we were sending people back to archives and making them go back and do research and all these things instead of just asking for editorial changes and things like that. I think it made it a better book, but it was at times like herding cats. But it was a great experience, and I got to make contacts with so many people in my field, and so far the book's been very well reviewed. I know where the holes are, so you always sit a little bit in trepidation, because you know where you see those areas that could have been more effectively exploited and maybe weren't. Right. But overall, it was a great I can say it now after the fact.
That's right.
It was a great experience.
Yeah, you got a book on your shelf. It's a great experience.
That's right.
Yeah, I find it interesting that the 2 of you guys decided to do this while you were still graduate students, because one of the things that I've started to think about now that my dissertation's done is approaching publishers now, which is sort of the next step, or not quite the next step, but like this notion of how do you do that? And especially when you're a graduate student saying, we want to put together an edited work. Because it's I could see if I was a publisher saying, 1, how are you guys going to do this? And 2, who are you to put together an edited work as a graduate student? So I'm just wondering what that process was like, and was it difficult to approach publishers with this book? Or was it helpful that you have Nicole St. Ange as your supervisor, who's a very well-respected scholar. Guillaume had Caroline Podruchny, who's another extremely well-respected scholar, if not one of the best in that field. That gives maybe you guys a little more authority to do this. Or did you just sort of do it on your own and say, this is what we want to do, we think you should publish it because it's going to be a good book?
That's a good question. From my recollection, I don't remember that we ever dropped our supervisors' names in the process.
Okay.
I'm sure it was written somewhere in a prospectus for the book, but I don't recall that we ever actually tried to overtly play that card. I'm not sure whether it would have had real resonance, because we approached, we approached American publishers. I mean, one of the things that I think people need to keep in mind is that publishers are there to publish. They want to find new materials. Right. They want to find interesting books. And because academic publishers are going to put things through a peer review process, you need to produce good scholarship. So some of them will ask you for chapters in advance. Some of them will want to see the manuscript before they decide whether they're going to send it out. With the first publisher that we were with, we were able to simply send in a proposal, and they were willing to give us an advance contract. Well, an advance contract's not worth all that much. It gives you a right of first refusal to the publisher.
Uh-huh.
So it's great for the publisher, but it's no guarantee for the editors or the authors.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really no big commitment on the part of the publisher themselves. The second press that we went to, which took it up, which was Michigan State, I simply picked up the phone. I called the editor for North American topics, spoke to her about it. She was fantastic. I said, we've got this book. It's a month out from being ready to send you the full manuscript. We were with this press. She was aware of what had been going on a little bit, and she said, we'd love to take a look at it, and most likely we'll be sending it out.
Wow.
It was that simple. Now, I'm not sure if that's because that was an American press, because I haven't published with a scholarly book with a Canadian press. But I found the process quite easy. It was a matter of sending emails and picking up the phones and saying what you're doing and whether they're interested in what the process was, and just following their process.
So just being proactive and being persistent.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that gives us hope, I guess, to those of us who may be intimidated. It seems like an intimidating process, but I mean, if it's no different than really anything else in life, do a good job, be proactive about it, and you'll get results.
Our thinking about it was that we had 4 or 5 presses in the U.S. where we wanted to do this. And we wanted to go with an American press simply because we had a combination of Canadian, American, and French scholars, and that an American press would likely give us the best circulation to hit all of those markets. It was since picked up by University of Manitoba Press, so that's an added bonus that it is automatically sent out in Canada now, and we're in the works to... Guillaume actually has taken this up to, if we're very lucky, to get it translated so that it will make the French audience as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. Well, it seems like a topic, like a book that would be very relevant to francophones, not just in Quebec, but across the country, or across the continent.
Yeah, we think so, and adds something, adds a whole bunch of papers, chapters that offer really interesting insights on French Aboriginal relationships, on not just the positive aspects of relationships, but even those failed relationships, and which doesn't delve so much into intermarriage and métissage, but rather focuses on bridge building between communities.
Now, just finally, you're here as the keynote, as we shift topic completely. You're here as the keynote at the Pierre Savard Conference. You are the founder of the Pierre Savard Conference.
Well, yes and no.
Come on, own it. Own it. You founded the thing.
Well,
you ran the first one.
I ran the first one, but it wasn't called the Pierre Savard Conference. It was my good friend Jamie Trepanier, who was a master's student at the time, who took over the second conference, who actually named it the Pierre Savard Conference with the blessing of the Savard family. And I always have to give that shout out because, yes, I started the first conference, but the thing I always keep conscious in my mind is that for a conference to make it 10 years, it means every year for 10 years there needs to be an organizing committee and people running that conference that pull it off and make it a success. And each year there's somebody else that needs to get that credit. And so it's great that I started up, but doing something for 1 year, I mean, anybody can go out and get something going once. Having something go 10 years in a row or longer, hopefully longer.
Hopefully. The committee, I don't know if the committee's been picked for next year, but the executive of the Graduate Student Association has been elected.
Perfect.
And they're good people, so it will happen next year.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
But it's getting that to happen over and over again, and getting students to buy in, and that student participation, and to have them own it. That real sense of ownership and pride in it. That's something that's a little bit more complicated. You can't guarantee, and there's no way I could have foreseen starting that first one that I would be back 10 years later to give a keynote. It's actually pretty special. Yeah,
it's got to be a little surreal too to think of that you've gone from being the guy, because I helped run it. I was one of the co-chair one year. That you're the guy running around, getting here at 7:00, in the morning for the panels that start at 9, running around, getting all the food, rearranging the furniture in the rooms, getting projectors and all that you go from being that guy to being the keynote, and you're on the posters and everyone's coming to see you.
I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to give a keynote than it is to organize the whole conference. I'll take the keynote any day.
Well, we were thrilled to have you. You gave a great speech the other day, and it was fun to have you here, and we're glad that you did it. And I know Madame Savard was excited to meet you as well.
That was great. That was a real privilege for me, too.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know Pierre Savard and his work, just Google him. And he's a very influential scholar who was at the University of Ottawa for a long time. There's actually, outside of the arts building here, there are pillars. And each pillar is named after someone as a pillar of the arts. And one of the pillars is named for Pierre Savard as one of the pillars of arts here at the University of Ottawa. So a very influential figure. And his name is attached to this conference that Robert founded. So I appreciate you being in Ottawa and coming doing the keynote. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me on the podcast today.
Oh, it was great. Thank you very much. Real pleasure.
If anybody has any comments or questions for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.